With the release of the new 24-man raid, I've been getting a lot of questions involving Final Fantasy XI and its potential place within the story of 14. And after playing through the raid a few times already, I was asked a question that sparked an entire conversation, and it has to do with the boss fight against the Archangels. You see, these characters are meant to represent the dark reflections of the 5 playable races within Final Fantasy XI. Apathy for Hyur, Envy for Mithra, Cowardice for Tarutaru, Arrogance for Elvan, and Rage for Galka. But what stood out to some of the people I was playing with were their weapons, primarily the fact that the Mithra was using a one-handed axe, and the Magish Tarutaru had a scythe. At first, they were comparing the hand axe to a boss in Eorzea, and they were comparing the Tarutaru with a scythe to Edda, as both of them wielded similar magics and used similar weapons. But partway through the conversation, I reminded them that Black Mage within Final Fantasy XI could equip scythes as a main weapon. This provoked an entire debate about the weapons within 11 and how they compare to Final Fantasy XIV. Within 14, jobs and their main weapon are kinda married at the hip. You can't have one without the other. But in 11, your weapon simply augmented your playstyle, instead of being a singular option. Black mages could use their staff, scythes, and even daggers if they so wanted to. Warrior could use over a dozen different weapon types, making their choices extremely flexible. Now, of course, all jobs in 11 had preferred weapons. A Dragoon still favored a spear over any other tool, obviously. But the system still allowed you to mix things up or try new styles if you ever wanted to. Maybe a new weapon and skill combo you try wasn't optimal, but if it was fun, then perhaps it was worth giving it a shot anyways. So today, let's indulge our creative side as we pick and choose what kind of weapon your favorite jobs in Final Fantasy XIV might use if given the chance. I of course will offer up my own picks, but I look forward to seeing what you have to say down in the comment section below afterwards. But before we get started, I have a few rules for this game. After all, this is a lore channel, so we'll be using our understanding of the lore to make our picks. The job's new weapon must already exist in the Final Fantasy XIV universe to some extent. So no crazy weapon ideas that we've never seen or heard from in other forms of media. The weapon needs to make sense for the job in question. They'd need to naturally encounter it in their history, or it has to fit their theme to some degree. The weapon in question should change how the job behaves on some level. After all, what's the point of giving them a new weapon if all they do is the same attacks and abilities as they did before? So, with our rules established and premise set, let us start with the mages. Magic within the lore of 14 is rather specific. You don't need a weapon to cast spells, but their presence alone can allow you to channel ether with more focus and in greater quantities than you ever could with your bare hands. That being said, all the healers and caster DPS still need some form of magical focus regardless of having a new weapon, making them a bit more limited. Which is why we're going to be getting them out of the way first. To start off with something simple, we'll be swapping the main weapons of Black Mage and Summoner. Black Mage using a book might seem strange, but we have to remember that the Thaumaturgus Guild is lined with tomes on arcane lore, so the idea of them being able to turn such books into a catalyst for spellcraft isn't impossible. The value a book might offer a Black Mage could help them step away from only using fire, ice, and lightning for a time, as they take advantage of distinct enchanted pages, possibly even using their magic to boost the elemental power of allies mid-fight, kinda like Vivi's supportive abilities in Final Fantasy IX. As for Summoner, while a staff won't have the long list of incantations they're used to, it's possible to create a staff that's attuned with specific affinities and elements in mind, potentially making the creation of a certain Eggy or Demi summon more powerful at the cost of less diverse spells. Instead of rotating through summons over and over, the summoner in question could potentially specialize in one particular demi-summon, and use that as their primary source of either damage or support. Red Mage was interesting, as having some kind of sword is usually their go-to in most Final Fantasy media, but 14 is special as they combine their rapier with a floating focus, and they're not the only job making use of a floating item. So we'll be giving Red Mage the Astrologian's Star Globe, minus the tarot cards because those are more for Astro than they are for the weapon. This change draws all the Red Mage's attention away from melee combat and toward pure casting potential. This would make it so that Red Mage can focus on ranged attacks while adding some specific ranged spells that wouldn't otherwise be possible with a sword in hand. As for Pictomancer, their lore hasn't existed long enough for me to say what a good alternative weapon would be with any real confidence. But I suppose giving them a magical pencil or pen would be a decent substitute for a brush and still stick with their drawing theme. Instead of the thick blobs of paint the Pictomancer uses now, why not methodical line art with angular and precise motions from, say, a fountain pen? Heck, you could potentially give them the quill from Arcanist and it might still work. Food for thought. Moving on to healers, we'll begin with White Mage. This one felt easy, as White Mage lore speaks of the ancient Imdapori making liberal use of golems during the War of the Magi. So instead of fighting at a distance, why not specifically focus on a magic buckler shield like they used to have in A Realm Reborn? Partner that with some sort of complementary melee weapon like with Red Mage, and now you have a White Mage that's prepared to fight in melee alongside their creations. This could potentially lean them towards more of a DPS role, but casting supportive spells and healing spells alongside their allies in the front lines would definitely shake things up for our typically ranged healer. Scholar, on the other hand, I'd give the White Mage's staff. A scholar without a book does feel strange and out of place, I agree, but this change in tactics likely would convert Scholar from a pure shield healer to more of a burst healer instead, allowing them to change their playstyle depending on the needs of the battlefield. After all, being prepared for any contingency is simply the essence of being a scholar. For me, Astrologian was the most unique of the healer changes, as I didn't give them a normal spell focus. Instead, I gave them the Dancer's Chakrams. Now, hear me out. Dancer already makes liberal use of etheric power during their performances, and the chakrams returning to their hands after being thrown can easily be explained away by magic. So why not give the chakrams to Astrologian, and make these bladed discs float around the caster like planets around a star? This would turn Astro to a much more DPS-focused mage in my opinion, but potentially adding a lot of flavorful stellar magic to their arsenal. And lastly, we have Sage. To be honest, I simply gave them the Scholar's Grimoire. This would likely remove its damage-focused kit in exchange for more targeted spells and buffs. After all, for as medical as Sage is supposed to be, it would be easier to break down a target when you can turn to the page that outlines their weaknesses. But with the magical DPS and healers settled, let's move on to the tanks, starting off with Paladin. This one was easy, as I'm taking a page out of Halone's book and replacing Paladin's sword with a spear. Heck, you could even give Paladin a spear and remove the shield, just like Templar from Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced. Either way, swapping out for a spear, in my own opinion, would make them more of a DPS-focused job, likely swapping out defensive buffs like cover for offensive buffs that support the party, helping Paladin lead the charge pointy tip first. Warrior, on the other hand, is rather basic. What you see is what you get, a heavy-hitting tank job with a big weapon. So, simply put, I'd give Warrior the Dark Knight's Greatsword, which on paper likely wouldn't change much. However, the way current Warrior uses their Great Axe is with heavy and deliberate swings that can shatter the very ground. So instead of ground-based attacks, what if the Warrior with a Greatsword saw them shearing away the very air itself, creating razor-sharp wind bursts with powerful arcing swings, possibly making Greatsword Warrior more skill speed focused as they move with the wind instead of against the earth. Meanwhile, Dark Knight was a very easy choice. Within Final Fantasy XI, Dark Knights could indeed make wonderful use of greatswords, but there's also another weapon that they were very talented with: scythes. And since Reaper already makes use of one, giving it to Dark Knight is an easy choice. A scythe-wielding Dark Knight would likely be more DPS focused, making their fighting moves more swift when compared to their current slow tank rotation, thus freeing them up to try new playstyles. Lastly, for tanks, we have Gunbreaker. So far I've given the tanks a more damage-focused alternative weapon, but what about Gunbreaker? It already is considered one of the more DPS-like of the tanks, so it makes sense to go the other direction and pick a weapon that might reinforce their defenses. Thus, sticking to Gunbreaker's theme of Magitech weaponry, I'd give them the gun shields, as revealed in the MSQ. Now, the shields on a Gunbreaker likely wouldn't be as huge and bulky, but gun shields would force them to sacrifice some of their fast-rotating DPS abilities in exchange for more solid DPS buffs and support abilities, possibly even giving them some unique ranged options as well, as the gun shields are seen shooting powerful shells at a distance. With that, we move on to ranged DPS. Bard is in a sort of weird position already, since it's a sort of hybrid of magical music and ranged archery to begin with. So why not ditch the bow entirely and focus on the Bard's namesake? It would be easy to give them a magically enchanted instrument like they have in Final Fantasy XI, but I feel like that one is a little too easy. So why not an enchanted baton instead? Or in this case, I suppose it would be more like the White Mage's wand in the shape of a magical baton. This would allow them to become the conductors of the battlefield, making the Bard completely forget about damage as they focus on buffing spells and potentially healing ballads. After all, the Bard's first limit break in Final Fantasy XIV was actually a healing limit break, so why not tap into that old lore just a bit? Machinist, on the other hand, is already a very well-established ranged DPS, so why not give them a melee option by offering them the Gunbreaker's Gunblade? Or perhaps some kind of gun daggers? Either way, this will give the Machinist a chance to utilize more melee-focused gadgets and Magitech instead of firing at a distance with rockets and lasers the whole time. It would certainly give them a chance to fight alongside the Automata Queen in the front lines, or perhaps even trade places. Give the Queen some powerful ranged abilities while the Machinist fights in melee. Following in its footsteps, I felt giving the Dancer a high mobility melee option made sense, seeing as their ability to move freely for their dance moves is necessary in their lore. In that case, I settled on giving them Paladin's Sword. The performance known as blade dancing or sword dancing is not only a real-world art form, but technically exists within Alamigo, even though the writers never really talk about this martial art much. So Dancer taking inspiration from this blade dancing art seems only natural. This would turn them from a ranged physical to a melee physical while still giving them the freedom of movement for their dances as necessary. And finally, we have the melee DPS. Starting with Dragoon, which was odd for me because Dragoons and Spears have been a married couple for many years before Final Fantasy XIV released. So giving them another weapon is tricky. However, I settled on giving them Viper's Twin Blade, specifically the combined form, as it still acts like a polearm when wielded properly. Sure, the Twin Blade might not have the same thrusting power as a spear, but it could still allow the Dragoon to make use of their jumping abilities with more fluid slashing attacks instead of outright jabs. Meanwhile, Monk is, well, Monk. How do you change the weapon of a job that never needed a weapon in the first place? This might feel like a lazy choice, but I felt giving Monk some kind of bow staff not only made sense, but would allow the Monk abilities to take advantage of the added reach a staff would offer them. Again, a lazy choice, but a safe one, I'd say. Samurai, on the other hand, was the most tricky in my opinion. The lore behind Samurai has everything to do with the fact that their EI jutsu is extremely close to spellcraft. By storing ether in the scabbard and letting their katana bathe in magical power, their strikes are impossibly fast and powerful. So I ask myself, what kind of weapon is still able to be stowed and soak the samurai's attacks in magic? Luckily, the samurai in our own reality were never known to just use katana. They were also accomplished marksmen. By giving samurai a bow, they could, in theory, allow their ether to soak the arrows whilst in the quiver before firing off enchanted shots. Sort of like an arcane archer, which gives samurai an interesting range DPS option for its trouble. And on the flip side, we have ninja. I always thought it was interesting how many of ninja's abilities make use of throwing something or sending projectiles toward the target. So instead of melee combat, why not give ninja some sort of ranged option with enchanted kunai? Most melee jobs have a single-use ranged attack, but what if it could be much more than that? Instead of just throwing some knives and being done with it, why not give them a full ranged rotation with throwing weapons, kind of like Dancer has? Second to last, we have Reaper. This felt like an inspired choice, seeing as Reaper already makes liberal use of void magic with their avatars. And another group of people also used void magic to great success, the Mages of Mach. So, instead of a scythe, I'd offer the Reaper a black mage staff and see what focusing purely on their void magics might do for them when physical melee strikes are no longer an option. With some training, they might even be able to perform some of the Void Sense necromancy spells. After all, they already made a deal with a demon, so what's raising a body or two at this point? And finally, we come to Viper. I'm gonna be honest, I have nothing for this one. Not only do I not have tons of lore on Viper to work with, but their weapon history isn't very fleshed out. So I could give them something like the ninja's daggers, but that wouldn't really change much on their fighting style as a whole. They're quick, so perhaps hand-to-hand combat like a monk? That would give them a bludgeoning option, but again, it doesn't feel like it changes too tremendously. Much like with Pictomancer, I'm infinitely more interested in what you yourself would give Viper aside from their twin blade. And that will finish up all the jobs and other potential weapons and options for them while still trying to stay faithful to 14's lore. To be frank, if instead of new jobs, the current roster simply gained new styles of play, you certainly wouldn't hear me complaining. But like I said before, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, so be sure to leave your weapon choices and options down in the comment section below. As for me, I'll continue picking apart the dialogue in Dawntrail to make sure all of my notes are as straight and organized as possible for later. But until then, stay safe, my friends. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoy my content, it would mean the world to me if I had earned you as a subscriber. We are currently on the road to 50k, and I'd love to have you as part of that journey. I'd also like to take this time to thank my amazing Patreon supporters. Nanama, Amina Viltaria, Slippers, Azkan Hawk, Naria O'Meara, Potato, Seth Rosewood, and Sinalv Bagel. Your support has always meant so much to me and helps to keep the content flowing with ease. If you're interested, there are additional links down in the description to my Discord, X, and other things as well. But until I see you again, I hope you're having an amazing day. Class dismissed.